back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today to discuss our topic, the threats, the geopolitical impact, and the concerns regarding maritime security in the Black Sea is Professor Charles Ridgway Jr. He is he's been on active duty in the past for 10 years as a nuclear power trained surface warfare officer in the Navy. He's had a significant background in the Navy Reserve in Africa's maritime security, working on assorted partnership cooperation activity. He's done a great deal of work as a Navy Foreign Area Officer for Africa. He's also worked as an editor at NATO's Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center in Lisbon. And after leaving NATO, he's been involved in assorted international development nonprofits in Colorado. We'll learn a little bit about what they are from him directly. And he is currently teaching monitoring and evaluation at Regis University in the MDP program, and we'll find out what that means as well. And recently he contributed an article to SIMSEC Maritime Security Center regarding the threats in the Black Sea, regarding what needs to be done to counter those threats, and why we are falling short of that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Washington Outsider Report.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Irina. I'm really excited to have this discussion.
You definitely have quite a background, and I was skipping over a lot. So I'll actually let you tell a little bit of the story, including what all of these things actually mean to the lay audience.
Okay, well, that could take a while to go into too much detail on all of it, but we'll start with the Navy stuff, because that's what's kind of defined a large part of my professional life. And I joined the Navy as an officer through the Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps. I was commissioned in 1993 and always knew I wanted to serve on ships. World War II naval history had been a sort of passion of mine from when I was a little kid, like an 8 or 9-year-old. That's all I wanted to read about and learn about. And so I always knew I wanted to be a surface ship officer. And I was lucky enough to be able to be accepted to the Reserve Officer Training Program and get commissioned as an ensign after studying mechanical engineering in Pittsburgh. And they also kind of tricked me into going the surface nuclear training pipeline. And as much as that was technically very interesting, the life of an engineer on an aircraft carrier is not nearly as exciting as the life of a division officer on an Aegis cruiser or frigate. So that part was probably the less exciting part of my career on active duty. And contributed a lot to why I ended up leaving active duty after about 10 years of service. I was very lucky that as a final active duty job, I got to be an exchange officer with the German Navy, where I served as assistant navigator on a German frigate for 3 years, operating out of Wilhelmshaven, but doing a lot of standing NATO naval forces and other deployments all around Europe, including some of the early Operation Active Endeavor deployments immediately after September 11th. And then from that deployment, I left active duty and went on to look for other things. And to be honest, part of the reason was I was going to have to go back to an aircraft carrier, and that did not really appeal to me.
So what kind of nonprofit work did you end up doing after all these things?
Well, after leaving active duty, I ended up I stayed in the Navy Reserve and did a fair amount of Navy Reserve stuff. And one of the things I was able to do was go on 6-month active duty orders to the NATO Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center that you mentioned in Lisbon. At that time, a fairly new organization, and they were looking to fill a civilian billet. And I was able to basically do a 6-month job interview while they're in uniform, and ended up getting hired out of it when my 6-month orders ended, and ended up staying almost 10 more years working at the JOLC, which is really very interesting because the JOLC was joint. Most of our work at that time was looking at things that were going in Afghanistan. And for those who aren't familiar with the JOLC, it's a very small organization that's part of Allied Command Transformation. And the idea was we need to have kind of a formalized lessons learned process, but also an operational analysis capability within the NATO command structure. And JOLC's main mission for the time I was there was to do operational analysis reports at the request of SHAPE on various topics that they were having trouble solving. So longer term research projects, the sort of thing that would take 6 months, a team of 3 or 4, looking at various pieces of NATO operations. And of course, in the period 2005 to 2015, when I worked there, the main operation was ISAF in Afghanistan, with another lesser ones, Operation Active Endeavor in the Eastern Mediterranean, Ocean Shield, the counter-piracy operation that came up somewhat later during that time period. And we would produce 30, 40-page sort of reports for SHAPE on how to better understand these operations, problems they were having, and a lot of sort of the stuff that was bothering NATO during that time period. And the JOLC still does that, although my understanding is now they've shifted more to kind of more formal assisting other commands with managing their own lessons, and they're doing a lot less of that kind of more formal long-term operational analysis.
I feel like there is still a good role for that, especially in the aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Right. Well, I'll say one thing, and it's the part that I'm particularly proud of from the work we did at JOLC. And as the editor, I touched pretty much every report that we wrote, and I ended up being rather familiar with most of the topics. But I'll say no one else in NATO, and it's something the U.S. military struggles with as well, is putting together a comprehensive report on a topic or a study with a list of reference documents, everything from operations orders to emails from commanders to subordinate commanders, that 15, 20 years from now, when somebody goes to write, for example, the history of ISAF, that stuff has become declassified. I think our reports are going to be a very key source for those, because nobody else was doing that kind of in-depth work and then writing it down in anything other than a PowerPoint slide. So I think that aspect of it, I think, was particularly valuable.
Yeah, that seems like a powerful tool, and I think I really do think that a lot of this long, in-depth strategic reflection comes in very valuable for any sort of organization, civilian or military, and of course, whether it's history or kind of reassessment of more current capabilities. I think that's the kind of information that anyone would be looking for. And now, thanks to you, researchers will know where to find it. Personally, I wouldn't have known that if not for your response right now.
Right. And most of the products at JOLC are NATO classified of some sort or another. There were a few that we produced that were unclassed, or we either released an unclassed version. I remember one we did on information sharing and counter piracy operations, and we classified the first report. And this will lead to some of the other work I did in Colorado, strangely, because I was contacted by a small nonprofit based in Colorado that was working on counter piracy issues. And they're like, we see that you released this report. Could we get a copy? And so we produced an unclassified releasable version. I mean, honestly, half the report dealt with interacting with merchant shipping on collecting piracy information, warning about piracy information, doing some of what NATO calls the NCAGs, the coordination of shipping to go through the dangerous parts of the waters. So it made sense that we would release a non-classified version of that report. And that got me hooked up with One Earth Future Foundation, where I ended up working 5 or 6 years after that happened for a little while. So.
And it sounds like a lot of the work that you've done concerned the Red Sea and Africa. How did that end up happening?
Well, that happened on the Navy Reserve side. So I
Mm-hmm.
didn't do a whole lot of work with Africa as a NATO international civilian, although I did do some. But just before I moved to Portugal to take the job with NATO, my reserve unit, which was at the time assigned to support Commander Naval Forces Europe, was transitioned into a unit to coordinate partnerships between that headquarters, which shortly afterwards was took over the Africa mission and became Naval Forces Africa, with African partner countries. And that was a time, 2004, 2005, when the US Navy realized we weren't doing much in Africa, but at that time also there wasn't much going on in Europe. And there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't much for the Navy to do. Land and air forces in Iraq and Afghanistan were kind of getting all the attention. And the Navy's like, well, we should be doing something. And, so there's some maritime security issues in, off the coast of Africa. And we should probably just build better partnerships with them right now. And I ended up getting in a unit that started doing that sort of thing. And I kind of fell in love with it. I don't know if you've ever traveled much in Africa, but like the first time you go, you either love it or you don't. And I was one of those who, after 3 days in Africa, was like, I love being here and I love working here. And so I kind of took advantage of the Navy Reserve side, which I kept doing the whole time I was working as a civilian at NATO, and ended up going to Africa quite regularly to support Naval Forces Africa missions there. When I left NATO, I continued working in a Naval Forces Africa Reserve unit. And when I did finally retire from the Navy a couple of years ago, I ended up finding other work that was related to that. So I still get to do it.
So what kind of countries were you partners with? I would assume Somalia for part of it, right?
So actually much less so Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. military's engagement in Somalia is largely special forces, direct support
Mm-hmm.
to Afghanistan. I didn't work counter piracy issues for the U.S. Navy, strangely. Not certainly not off Somalia and not at the height of it. Some in the Gulf of Guinea later. Um, but and then Somalia is also a really hard place to get U.S. personnel into just because of the security situation,
Mm-hmm.
the requirements to do that, and the training that you have to have. And so it's very hard to get particularly reservists into Somalia. Whereas we were doing a lot of stuff in Naval Forces Africa was doing a lot of stuff, whole exercise programs trying to build up the capabilities of African navies. So a lot of that was Gulf of Guinea. Most of my work up until about 2018 was Gulf of Guinea. Senegal, Ghana did a deployment as the liaison officer aboard a Belgian ship where we hit several Gulf of Guinea countries and participated in several multinational exercises. So it was more that side until about 2018. And then sort of East Africa started, just opportunities came up to go and support missions in East Africa. And I was always one to say, yes, yeah, I'll go. So.
Well, that experience surely comes in handy now as you look upon the developments um, on both sides, on the political side and also on the military and maritime side that are quite that are keeping the place alive and interesting, maybe a little bit too much so for many people's taste.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So is that some of the things that you teach about in your class at Regis?
So no, and I have to be fair, I haven't done the Regis class for a couple of years now. Kind of COVID was the last time, and then
Oof.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then these things happen, and then certain certain relationships don't get restarted. And I keep meaning to call up and say, hey, I'd be interested in doing it again, but I've just been so busy, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's been a couple of years since I've done that. That was very much for civilian
Mm-hmm.
development work, you know, building up schools, supporting orphanages, the sort of capability. But it was very similar in philosophy to the sort of work the U.S. Navy was doing with Africa. And then with the lessons learned background from NATO, in the NGO world these days, the international development NGO world, so monitoring and evaluation is like, this is how we prove that the things we're doing are having the effect that we want it to have.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very similar to the lessons learned work I did at the NATO Lessons Learned Center. So it all kind of matched together. And then I was, hooked up when we moved back to Denver in 2015 with There's like a kind of a shared workplace in Denver called the Posner Center, where there's about 30 or 40 small little international development nonprofits that work together, and then they all have this, they share offices and the printers and things like that. And so you go over there and you kind of get into that network. And sadly, that's another thing that since COVID, I haven't been over there since COVID, and it's only a 10-minute drive from my house. So I really ought to get back into that. But that led to kind of a couple of different links with some small NGOs. I did a monitoring and evaluation framework for a very small NGO. It's basically one guy on this side with an annual budget of about $50,000. But he had 9 employees in Kenya, and he had started out distributing donated children's books to elementary schools in Kenya, and had found that he'd had mission creep to where he was doing all like sanitation projects in schools and income generating activity for the school district. I was like, man, you are 82 years old. You can barely fly to Kenya these days without like passing out. Maybe you ought to like, maybe the monitoring evaluation result should be, let's go back to just distributing books and find someone else to take over some of these other tasks that you have. So, but it was those kind of organizations that I was working with, and that ended up getting hooked up with the program at Regis that also has connections to those organizations at the Posner Center.
That's amazing, because I have to say, I think this monitoring and evaluation element, while it's something that's constantly coming up in government contracting
Oh
types
yeah,
of projects, I'm not sure how often it actually lines up with the end
I've
results.
done some work on monitoring evaluation at AFRICOM too, kind of voluntary. It's like, hey, I've got some experience with this. It's hard to do properly
Mm-hmm.
under any circumstances. It's really hard for the government to kind of wrap its head around it. And I would say that one of the problems you have with the monitoring, like the intrinsic problem you have with establishing a monitoring evaluation project or program, is the same that we saw with the lessons learned program working in NATO. Was as soon as you set up a lessons learned cell or a lessons learned center, everyone thinks that they're doing all the learning. We're like, no, 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 no. We don't need to learn how to like run a provincial reconstruction team better. You guys running the provincial reconstruction teams need to learn that. We can help you, like if you're having trouble like finding a way to gather the data or figure
Mm-hmm.
out what questions you need to ask and how to answer. We can help you do that. But you're the one who's having the real life experiences, and you're the ones who need to change your behavior to improve, to show improvement. And all those programs, I saw the same thing at AFRICOM. They set up a monitoring evaluation cell, and then everyone complained that the monitoring evaluation cell wasn't giving them any answers. I was like, well, you giving them any information? It's like, well, no, that's their job. So, that's just something that happens. You put that name on it, and everyone thinks it's their job now to do it, and you don't have any responsibility left to support it.
Oh my gosh, that's that, and it's funny that you mentioned all these important experiences, because they will come up in the topic of our conversation on the US policy side. But that brings me actually, and it's a great bridge to asking, how is it, from having all this background, mostly Africa, Red Sea region, and of course the NATO Center, you decided to write an article about the Black Sea? That seems completely out of the blue given your life experience.
Well, I think maybe that's why I wrote it, is because all of a sudden I had like these ideas about something that I was new to me. I did a fair bit of research and reading. What happened was about a year and a half ago, I started working for the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation's Institute for Security Governance, based out of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and they provide training, through security cooperation programs, various kinds of training to foreign military officers. And they have an in-residence course in Monterey, which I've participated in as an instructor a couple times now. And we were invited through one of the programs at Naval Postgraduate School to participate last September in a Black Sea Maritime Domain Awareness Symposium. And so I went along as the maritime domain awareness subject matter expert, because that's a lot of what we were doing in Africa. Was turn on the lights, fighting sea blindness, getting governments to recognize the importance of sea power and maritime security. And so I went to this Black Sea Symposium and just came away like, there's a lot going on here that probably, just the way the conversations went down left me with more questions than answers, but a lot of like the answers should be a lot easier than they seem to be. And that was sort of the inspiration for writing this article. I had my own ideas about maybe what the answer should be and thought they were worth sharing.
And I think it's a fascinating because, quite frankly, I don't see nearly enough, at least in the open source domain, about this situation, and no practical recommendation certainly about how to deal with it, despite the fact that it is a very important topic. So, um,
I
that
agree
brings.
with you. I think there's not a lot of open source that tries to say something new. Part of that is people who have access to the real information are, they can't share it because our symposium was completely unclassified, and I haven't had any access to classified information on that area for years and years, since well before the conflict in Ukraine began. So I felt fairly open on that sense. All of my research was open source, stuff just that I was able to find through libraries and online. But what I really found most distressing at that symposium was people were just like, yeah, it's okay what's going on there. I mean, it's not great, but there's not much we can do about it. I was like, well, I think there are things we can do about it. And it's certainly the indignation should be a lot higher. Like there should be a lot more in the press about random Palau flagged freighters getting boarded 30 miles off the coast of Turkey. And that for me was really the part of that whole story that's like, people shouldn't be just be standing by and saying, yeah, it's war, so we should let that happen. And I think that there was more that could be done, and I wanted to say something about that.
Well, that's sort of fascinating because actually, up until recently, there was sort of this general attitude towards the Red Sea component as well. It's only when this became the fighting with the cookies became really a constant, and it started seriously
Mhm.
impacting, the shipping industry, that this level of indignation started to sort of rise, and only as a pragmatic response to costs, not necessarily the principle of the fact that you have a sort of terrorist slash piracy type of situation with
Yeah.
foreign ships being attacked constantly. So it may be that it's only the level of impact that stimulates indignation, but I could be wrong, and I hope I am.
I do think it's interesting to compare and contrast the two geographic regions and the
Mhm.
two, you know, let's call them adversarial actors, if you want to call Russia and the Houthis that there wasn't a whole lot of outrage that the Russians were just randomly boarding ships, or they have hit in port, so they probably weren't aiming at the ships that they hit, but they have hit ships in port with cruise missile attacks. Um, Compared to like the immediate, like almost immediately response of large naval forces in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden to kind of protect ships from what's going on with the Houthis. And I find that contrast rather intriguing. I don't know whether I have an answer for it, but I think the fact that it's there is itself worth investigating.
Well, I'm going to ask a little bit of a provocative question, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which also may help frame the discussion for those in the audience who are not familiar with the geography and history of the Black Sea region. And I also want to ask, well, first of all, I want to ask, can you discuss the parameters of what and where we're talking about specifically? I think some people are just barely getting acquainted with the Red Sea, and here we are throwing for them a new area for them because they hear the Black Sea, they think the general vicinity, oh, Ukraine, Turkey, but they might not really understand what that area is and its importance and its
Yeah.
role historically. And the other question is, what type of ships are being attacked in the Black Sea? Because in the Red Sea, we know that the immediate response was a focus on first commercial ships, and then once the warships started coming in, they also became targets. But other than the vague grain related situation in the Black Sea, I don't think there is really great coverage of who and how is being attacked in the Black Sea.
I think I can address the last part. The great coverage is that most news outlets they're not particularly familiar with military generally.
Mm-hmm.
And they turn to a certain number of experts who kind of are their go-tos to explain certain things. And you might end up with an Air Force guy, on some news channel explaining, something about the Navy. And then I would say of the military services, the one that, and this is not just in America, but I think in most countries, of the military services, the one that people understand the least, what its role is, what it takes to make it work, is the Navy. And most people don't really understand sea power. News outlets don't understand sea power. I'm guessing none of the anchors at any of the major international or American networks have read Mahan's book, for example. So the Navy is kind of a big mystery, and it's exciting and impressive with the big ships and guns sticking out the front, and let's watch a video of them shooting a missile, but they don't really understand what it's all for. So you get very oversimplified reporting that often is just kind of factually, maybe not wrong, but kind of factually dumb, if that makes sense. Like, dude, like you way oversimplified that. And it's much more complex, and there's all these things going on. So I think part of why the reporting might not be that good is because of those reasons. To the geography, there's probably a tendency to compare Red Sea and Black Sea in certain ways, because the Red Sea is entered by a very narrow channel, the Bab el-Mandeb. The Black Sea is entered by a very narrow channel, the Turkish Straits. And there is a difference, though. The Bab el-Mandeb, there is another way out of the Red Sea, and that's the Suez Canal. There is no other way for most ships out of the Black Sea. If you are a Donbass type river barge, you can actually get all the way to the Baltic on various canals and up the Volga, from the Volga-Don Canal, or down into the Caspian Sea. But that's a very specific class and measurement of ship. Your average ship is not going to be able to, take that route out of the Black Sea. So there's only one way in or out. The other difference is that one country controls that entrance. And for the Black Sea, that's, I'm supposed to say Turkey now, so I guess I'll say Turkey. They control that. And, a lot of people talk about Montreux, but the only reason Turkey is holding itself to Montreux is because Montreux meets their needs. And I mentioned that in the article. If they didn't care about it, they could throw it out the window any minute, and there's not much that really anyone could do about it. And that includes Russia. The whole idea behind Montreux is Turkey had certain sovereignty needs that it wanted to fulfill at the time that it was negotiated. But the great power on the other side of the Black Sea, Russia, at that time the Soviet Union, had needs that it wanted to guarantee and was probably willing to go to war with Turkey over at that time. And the greatest naval power in the world, Britain, and to a certain degree France, who's also a signatory, they also had needs to get in and out of the Black Sea. Part of that to keep an eye on the Soviet Union. And they were willing to go to war with Turkey. And it would have been a naval war, and they probably wouldn't have tried to force the straits again the way Churchill did in 1915. But Turkey at that time was in a position to be like, maybe we don't want to go to war with everyone. Okay, these are the rules that we'll play by. And those rules now meet Turkey's needs, which is probably the main reason they haven't thrown Montreux out the door and just said, we will decide who comes and goes, and whoever the highest payer is, or just our friends, or whatever. And there's, at the moment, not much that either Russia or other naval powers outside the Black Sea could probably do about it, unless they wanted like full-scale war. So
now there's a good level of understanding about the volume of trade and its importance going through the Red Sea, 10 to 20 to as high as 20%. A lot of oil and gas trade, a lot of it reaching the Far East countries, Japan, South Korea, and so forth. So I think people are starting to at least conceptually understand the importance in terms of international maritime trade, freedom of navigation. Black Sea, everyone just thinks grain from Ukraine to wherever. I don't think there's been, people have heard bits and pieces about grain crisis in Eastern Europe and deliveries. I don't think there is a whole lot of understanding of what that actually means and why is it important for the international community, much less the US. Could you tell us a little bit about what is actually what's at stake here?
I'm certainly no expert on the global financial aspects
Mm-hmm.
of merchant shipping, but I think you wrap that up really quite nicely. There's an awful lot of trade of every single sort that goes through the Red Sea, and it's basically 10 to 14 days more to go around southern Africa, which is a lot more gas. A friend of mine who is in the shipping business has told me recently, and he's a shipper. He's in private practice, but he's like, I'm making money hand over fist right now because, and it's good for the shipping industry in some ways because there was an overcapacity the last couple of years, and now the extra 10 to 14 days has sucked up that extra capacity. So there's not like ships that are sailing, not fully loaded at the moment, thanks to what the Houthis are doing. So the shipping companies are like, it's fine with us. That's what he told me. So, but yeah, you hit the nail on the head. There is, as a dead end, the Black Sea, what's coming out of there is, some Russian oil, and grain from both countries, Russia and Ukraine. And other than those countries that depend on that grain for affordable feeding of their people, it's probably not as significant to the world economy as the Red Sea. And I suspect the two aspects that have made the Red Sea so much for the international community so much quicker to respond with high-end warships and engaging in combat operations. This is the most intense naval warfare we've seen since the Falklands. What's going on in the Red Sea right now, that is the fact that it's global shipping going to numerous different ports carrying every different kind of cargo that enters the Red Sea, whereas that is a much more limited thing, and Turkey controls the entrances to the Black Sea. Those are the two differences. You can't send your high-end warships into the Black Sea unless Turkey says it's okay.
So Turkey has at some point allowed Western ships to gain entry into the area, but nevertheless, and despite that, the problems seem to persist. Yes, Ukraine has been exceptionally good at, attacking Russian vessels, but that still doesn't clarify for many of us, what is the current status of the situation, and was it only the Ukrainian grain carrying vessels that were attacked, or other countries' ships and types of vessels affected as well?
Right. The only interdiction against a merchant ship that I know of that Russia has done deliberately, there's been some
Mm-hmm.
mine strikes, and then both sides say, "Oh no, that wasn't our mine." Was the boarding of the Shukua Khan. So as far as I know, Russia has not deliberately targeted any ships from Ukraine. They have said they would and could and might, that anything engaged in that trade will be considered a belligerent and could be targeted and sunk. They haven't actually done it yet, to my knowledge. Nobody knows. I certainly don't know. Are they actively targeting it? Like, oh, we're ready to fire our missile now. We don't know that necessarily. But the point to me, and I tried to make this in the article, the other part that made me very indignant and made me surprised that the rest of the world wasn't more indignant, is that in order to avoid that, the corridor, they stay in the territorial waters of Bulgaria and Romania. They're not transiting what is, according to UN clause, according to international convention, the international waters of the Red Sea, or so of the Black Sea. They are hugging the coast to stay safe. And that tells me that those international waters are not open for international business. And that should really be bothering more people than it seems to bother. So
So,
that's why I kind of address that point. And that's why I argue, yeah, the Black Sea has become a Russian lake because the merchant community, for whatever financial reasons are out there, have chosen not to use those waters. The mere threat at a single boarding has convinced them that it's not worth it to try.
so to some extent, this maritime aspect of the war in Ukraine has been treated as incidental to the land-focused Russia's strategy of reclaiming its past greatness or whatever. Or, if you want to look at it from geopolitical point of view of gaining access to the vast natural resources and monopolizing, creating a monopoly and under its control in that regional area. But the maritime aspect seems to be just as important if you look at history, where Russia vied for maritime primacy in the region against the Ottoman Empire before that became modern day Turkey. And it certainly looks to me, zooming out of the Ukraine focused lens, that there is a sort of relitigation of World War One, pre-World War One issues a little bit.
Yeah.
Is
Or
is
possibly
Russia playing that sort of a
World War
game?
I,
Hmm?
like some Russian Revolution issues still being resolved there too. I definitely agree with you on that point.
So why is it that people are so focused exclusively on the land-based ambitions of the Kremlin and not so much looking at what they're doing in the waters, and more importantly, why they're doing it? Everyone
Mhm.
just focused on the trade, that they want to steal the grain and make money. But it
Yeah.
seems to me that there's also a strategic value to it that we're not really discussing. And if we're not discussing the strategy, then we can't really fight this war successfully. We don't understand what the aims are.
Well, I think there's two. The Kremlin and Putin have two main aims, and one is just kind of dominance.
Mm-hmm.
A very vague, but like sort of a nationalistic, like we can't tolerate a free and independent Ukraine that's aligned with the West. Certainly not the eastern parts that have, the parts that he sees in 2014. But, and this is not my idea, but I find it very convincing. John Conrad over at G Captain did a very interesting interview with the guys at Midrats. That's a maritime focused podcast, where he argued that there were very strong maritime goals, that the whole idea is to completely control the Sea of Azov, like, and that now is a safe corridor for all Russia's ships coming up and down the Don. And the reason that they were willing to agree to the Green Deal was that prior to, well, Mariupol was still in Ukrainian hands, Ukrainian artillery could easily shoot, lob 105 millimeter howitzer shells at passing Russian ships coming out of the Don and heading for Kerch. As soon as they seized Mariupol and owned the whole rest of the coast of the Sea of Azov, controlled the entire Sea of Azov, that danger went away. And it's not to say that Ukrainians still couldn't
Mm-hmm.
attack Russian merchant ships in the Sea of Azov, but now they can't just simply sit on the beach and shoot artillery at them. It's a much more high end, sophisticated operation that they'd have to do to start doing that. And also, Ukraine wasn't doing these sophisticated surface drone attacks prior to the Green Deal falling apart. That's sort of a new tactic that's emerged since then. It's been very successful at what they've done, but they're not targeting merchant ships with it, not yet, anyways. So I think in that sense, one, you have the very high level, like the egotistical Putin sort of strategic goals, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have very like, we don't like that we have to share this important waterway with Ukraine on the other side of the channel coming out of the Don. And I think that's a very important. I think Captain Conrad makes a very strong argument that that's an important military strategic goal of Russia in this conflict.
So essentially, what that gives Russia is creating the impression that they are the ones calling the shots in the neighborhood, and they are the ones controlling the waterways, even if there is Turkey nearby. But Turkey is not going to go fighting over the Sea of Azov. Turkey only cares about the actual passage that it controls. So
Yeah,
so long as Russia maintains that balance, it doesn't go too far. Turkey certainly will not have the jurisdiction and the authority to intervene, nor has any
yeah,
geopolitical reasons to at the moment. So what we are seeing is that Russia is actually carving out this piece of maritime territory under its
Hmm.
control and expanding its reach that way, while we're just looking at its territorial gains on land. We're also not really admitting that it actually has made significant maritime gains. And what does that mean for
I
this
think that sums it up
neighborhood?
beautifully. I think that's exactly what they're trying to accomplish. And if you think about the situation after 2014, even after Russia had seized Crimea, there's still a maritime boundary down the middle of the Sea of Azov where Ukrainian territorial water runs up against Russian territorial water. And now, de facto, that boundary is gone. The Sea of Azov definitely is a Russian lake. The rest of the Black Sea, I'm quite surprised. And I'm not a Turkey expert. I haven't set foot in Turkey in several years, except passing through Istanbul Airport, which you do a lot of stepping in Istanbul Airport because it's the biggest airport I've ever been in, and nothing seems to be within a kilometer. But that aside, I don't know what's going on in Turkey, but I'm surprised that they're not more upset that they seem to have lost a certain amount of sea control over waters that are very clearly of importance to them. And as one of the comments on my article at SimSec was, Turkey could shut down the Black Sea to Russian shipping anytime it wanted, and that's actually true. I hadn't considered that that Turkey might be able to do that, but they could just stop letting any ship coming out of the Don through the straits. They could do that if they wanted to, and that would set Russia back quite a bit if they weren't able to get their shipping out of the Black Sea.
So this is something I don't get. Militarily, Turkey has, I would say, a pretty strong military, even with all the political upheaval and so forth. Maritime, I am not an
Mm-hmm.
expert on how it compares to Russia, but I would say given Russia's, you know, challenges, I would say the Turkey naval is still in a pretty good position. Is that is that
Oh,
accurate?
I think I've always been impressed working with the Turkish Navy,
Mm-hmm.
including 20. I hate to say it, 23 years ago when I was doing stuff in the Mediterranean aboard the German frigate where I was the exchange officer. We did a lot of work. We always had a Turkish ship in our group, and they were always very impressive, and their ships were in great shape. And in those days, they were operating some very old fast attack craft. We were parked in Aksaz, one of their big naval bases on the Mediterranean side. And at the next pier were some of these older, former German fast torpedo boats. And those boats at that time were close to well over 30 years old. And we went over one and had tea just to visit. And it was beautiful. Every speck of brass was perfectly polished. And they got those things underway. And as soon as they cleared the pier, they put the throttle down and off they zipped at 40 knots right out of the bay. I've always been very impressed with the Turkish Navy. And in the last few years, they've very much developed a homegrown ability to build very impressive ships. They've just commissioned a drone carrier slash amphibious ship that is very impressive from looking at it from what I can find online, and a homegrown batch of frigates, the Istanbul class, that are also very impressive looking. And the fact that they've developed that capability to build sophisticated warships, let's call it in the last 15 years, that's quite impressive. The Turkish fleet is very capable of dealing with the Russian Black Sea fleet, should it come to something like that. There's no question. So I don't think it's I don't think what's holding Turkey back from engaging more and pushing back more is a fear that they're somehow their fleet is not up to the task. That's not what's going on there.
So
It's a political level, and
it's
I'm not in a position to comment more.
yeah, it sounds like some sort of a political understanding or arrangement, and wouldn't be the first time for Turkey and Russia to come to political understanding and arrangements. Libya, Syria, and so forth are just some of the examples where the two compete, but also come to sort of, you know, um, mutually satisfying boundaries that keep them out of direct engagement and conflict uh, at,
Mm-hmm.
at various points. That said, I think I'm not entirely sure how much all of that is being taken into consideration. So we are seeing that there is there has been economic and political impact resulting from all of this, just not necessarily directly to the US. We've heard a lot about Eastern European and Central European countries affected by the grain disruptions. And now Russia has also used the situation to sort of to its advantage in Africa as well, because some of the West African countries have been very much dependent on grain, and Russia is giving them for free, and they're stealing Ukrainian grain and also selling it off as their own and just making money off that. So it's not to say that there's been not a huge disruption. It's just that the particular ways it's been these disruptions have not directly affected an average American or West or maybe even Western Europe, Northern European countries.
Not in ways that they can feel, and I don't think it's caught the imagination of people
Mm-hmm.
the way that landing a helicopter load full of guys on a ship passing the Yemen coast or shooting anti-ship missiles at them has caught people's imagination. I think there's that aspect of it too. When we do see parts of the naval conflict in the Black Sea, it's usually drones published by Ukrainian forces or videos of Ukrainian forces of their drone attacks, which have been kind of sensational and exciting and fun. And it gives the impression, though, that Russia's losing. And I think maybe they're losing those tactical engagements. And I can only guess that they're smart enough to be like, okay, how do we defend against these drone boats? That sooner or later they're going to get better at that. But I don't think that they're losing at the strategic level. I think they still control the Sea of Azov. They still more or less can dictate who can use most of the Black Sea. And sensational drone attacks aside, Ukraine hasn't been able to kind of change that situation, and neither has the rest of the West, which you would think would, if nothing else, just based on principle, the principle that Russia is a signatory of UN clause, and those waters are international, and they haven't declared a war, and they haven't declared a blockade. So there's nothing legal about what they're doing.
So let's actually use the imagination that so many aren't, and let's take this a step further. We are already seeing that Russia, on a strategic level, has achieved significant gains, if not a victory. At some point, its strategic goals were to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea, and a lot of it has been to some extent achieved, and nobody has really acknowledged that it has actually met that strategic goals. We've been talking about Russian entrenchment in various areas and fights over, symbolic small villages and cities, and how far Russia has gained versus how far they've been pushed back. But the fact is, they have succeeded in a very major part of their strategy. Where do we go from here? Let's imagine Russia continues holding on to that area. Let's say the situation in Ukraine continues more or less the same way for foreseeable future. How far, if Russia wants to be making significant and quick strategic progress into areas beyond Ukraine itself, what can it do with its maritime gains?
Ooh, that is a very interesting question. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I haven't thought that through at that point. Just sort of, I don't know what more there is to do that wouldn't actually bring them into conflict with countries and thus trigger Article 5. Their gains in the Black Sea don't necessarily help them elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like all of a sudden the Pacific Fleet or the Northern Fleet has more freedom of movement just because the maritime part of Russia's strategy is hasn't been defeated yet. Let's call it that in the Black Sea. So I'm not sure. As long as they are getting their shipping out through the Turkish Straits, probably the situation we have right now is one they're happy with. They don't need to do a whole lot more until something changes where no longer can stop Ukraine.
So it would be fair to say that they would engage in further aggression if A, they were in distress, significant distress from something happening on land and they needed to send a message to distract, divert attention and or
Yeah,
gain, or if they have actually achieved significant success in Ukraine, get much
yeah,
further than anyone, foresees, and at that point they feel free and feel
yeah.
empowered to cause additional disruptions.
Yeah. Well, I think where Ukraine's sea denial efforts have been quite successful is it's going to prevent the Black Sea Fleet from supporting any sort of operation along the coast between the Crimea Peninsula and Odessa. So, and the new ports are probably close enough to Romania as well, but all of that's within Ukrainian cruise missile range. So they're not going to like attempt to do an amphibious landing at this point. They're not going to attempt to force that northwestern part of the Black Sea. So I think they're probably quite happy with their fleet more or less safe in Novosibirsk, Novorossiysk, I'm sorry. And that, yeah, I don't see that situation. There's another aspect which actually just occurred to me is they haven't boarded anyone else since. And, despite the fact that the threats apparently are still open that they could and would. And I'm wondering if they didn't say, ooh, maybe we should be careful here. Maybe that's a bridge too far. And maybe it's one thing to board a Palau flagship. But if we board someone, with a little more chutzpah behind the flag, that might be pushing things too far. So I don't know. I have no idea if that's any of the Russian calculus or if they're just afraid of drone strike, like surface drones. So
Mhm. Well, in the meantime, let's look at the NATO side of the equation because NATO's role in all of this has been quite mystifying to me personally. I can understand why lay Americans or European, civilians may not understand the value of all of these things. What strikes me as a lot more preposterous is that NATO countries on a top level, are not seeing the problem with what's happening. Why has the NATO apparatus been not more outraged? Why have they allowed Russia's bullying? And could all of this whole situation with this blockade been predicted earlier on in the war by NATO and by others? And be do what could have been done earlier to disrupt it, and what could be done now?
right. I can only speculate
Mm-hmm.
on the thinking going on in various NATO headquarters. I still have some friends who work in NATO, but I don't haven't talked to them overly about this issue. And I think the general I don't want to call it outrage, but not being happy with the situation can be felt in sort of the communications you see, the public communications you see from NATO leadership. And I haven't looked at NATO Maritime Command in Northwood, just outside London. I haven't looked at their like news feed about like, oh, and we're really upset about this, but I don't think they're putting stuff like that out there. And they're talking about it inside those headquarters. Some of it is that NATO, like the rest of the world, is very land focused. The Joint Force Commands, the SHAPE headquarters are all very land personnel heavy. And really, Marcom is the only one thinking at operational strategic level about maritime issues within the NATO command structure. That's always been kind of a fact, something we wrote about at the Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center when I was there. That could play a role. And then we don't know what's going on behind the scenes too. There's an
Mm-hmm.
awful lot of diplomacy. There's an awful lot of, the ambassador beforehand say, these are the maritime things we want you to address the next time you are in Russia, talking to, the powers that be in Ankara, talking to whoever's talking to whoever. We don't know that, and there very well may be some very strong language going on there, and we just the results on the outside.
But do you think they foresaw a possible blockade early in the war? Because I remember, reading all these articles about how, people seem to have been aware of Russia trying to kind of get to this exact result. But a lot of the effort was seemed to be not really. There didn't seem to be any urgency or panic concerning the fact that they were trying to do exactly that. It just didn't. But what I can't tell is whether it was just the media coverage or whether that was also the political sense. But certainly, if it was the political sense, the outcome was in the sense of should Ukraine have asked for and gotten assistance more closely related to these maritime goals? Should it be asking for more now? Is it a priority related to some of the other things?
So, I don't know what Ukraine is or isn't asking for right now. The Neptune missile was, developed in
Mhm.
Ukraine based on previous Western designs, but that's a homegrown product and a quite impressive one. So I don't know what Ukraine is asking for. I think as far as should we have predicted, I think the whole conflict, as I recall 2 years ago, there was maybe 2 or 3 weeks where, oh, it looks like something might happen. And I remember thinking, no, it can't actually happen. This is all bluster and massing troops on the border just
Mhm.
to something. I do think people were taken by surprise. And I think, if you remember, everyone thought Kyiv would fall in a couple of days or at most a couple of weeks. And probably at that point, it's like, oh, all these tanks on the border. I don't think anything in the Black Sea is actually going to matter. The Russian Black Sea fleet is huge and will probably just support with an amphibious landing in Odessa, and that'll be the end of that. And that it turned out to be much more complicated, I think, is and that Ukraine did such a nice job of defending itself,
Mhm.
and that the Russians did such a terribly poor job of launching that initial land attack, took a lot of people equally by surprise.
In the meantime, we know that during various parts of the war, Russia and Turkey did have some tensions over the Montreux enforcement. And what exactly has that all been about? And we don't know what are the terms of the political arrangements, but we have seen some tensions in Turkey's efforts to balance its NATO obligations with self-interest with Russia, kind of linked, you know, agreements. What exactly is going on there from where do they actually stand on the military arrangement?
I'm not able
Front?
to address that question at all. I really have no idea what sort of discussions Russia and
Mm-hmm.
Turkey have had behind the scenes. Um, I do think it's interesting that Turkey, of all NATO members, has closer and more sort of networky relations with Russia, both at a business level and at political level, in a way that probably no other NATO country does. But what sort of communications and
Mm-hmm.
requests and denials are go over that communication path, I really don't know. But I suspect that the fact that Turkey is preventing Russian warships from going in and out, um, not allowing them to, reinforce the Black Sea Fleet, like with a sort of home port change from something from some other station, Baltic or North Sea or Northern Fleet, probably has Russia a little bit annoyed because they are losing ships and they're not able to replace them.
So we don't know whether that's actually NATO's a deference to NATO or entirely self-interest, but we do know that there is some level of division attributable to various factors. To what extent can NATO capitalize more on that? What can be done to actually put more pressure in on those, on those points?
So I was actually talking about this with someone today, is that I don't know what leverage the other NATO countries have over Turkey right now. Like, hey, you don't do this, we're not going to do that sort of leverage. Um, we kind of talked about it for a little bit today and really didn't have any good ideas. But the people who are doing the diplomacy, hopefully they know those answers and maybe there is something. There are ways to, under Montreux, non-belligerents are still supposed to be able to use the straits. And Turkey's just said, we're just going to make this simple. No warships can go through right now, belligerent or non-belligerent. But under Montreux, it's possible for them to say, we're still adhering to Montreux and allowing neutral, non-belligerent warships in. I would hope that a lot of the diplomatic efforts with Turkey right now are towards that end. And then there's an example, it doesn't directly translate, and it might be silly, and I haven't thought this through all the way. But at the beginning of World War I, a German squadron in the Mediterranean, the battle cruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, escaped the British Mediterranean fleet by sailing into Istanbul. And the British they can't stay there without violating neutrality. 72 hours and they out. And what the Germans did was sell the ships to Turkey along with the crews. And Admiral Suchan stayed in command of that fleet for the rest of World War One. Turkish, I think he put a Turkish emblem on his German Navy hat. And that was about the only change, that and the flags on the two ships. And it would be possible to, in a similar manner, to sell ships to Romania. Or if you really wanted a flag from some non-Black Sea country, you could buy a Romanian or Bulgarian ship. Like, oh, the Bulgarians have decided to sell us one of their corvettes. And then off you go with a crew and take it over and fly a German or a British or a US flag off that ship. Those things are possible, but they're very, very unlikely. But it could be done if you were really determined to get somebody else's flag into the Black Sea on a warship right now, or to reinforce Romania and Bulgaria. When I last checked, the US was trying to get rid of its littoral combat ships. Just saying.
Interesting development in case. I do think there's been a surprising kind of lack of creativity on that front. There's been a lot of good, positive brute force and power and powerful weapons, not a lot of creative thinking, as far as I see.
Right. And, admittedly, this conflict has gone on for 2 years now. During World War II, U.S. industry was churning out an aircraft carrier every 9 months and a Liberty ship every 5 days. There could have been some new construction inside the Black Sea over the last 2 years. Of course, nobody realized the conflict would go on this long, but it's never too late to start.
Yeah, actually, even as of last year, analysts have been predicting at least 2 more years. Now it's been extended to probably another 2 years from that. So I'm actually surprised that in light of these predictions, nothing has been recalibrated to that, long-term kind of conflict mode. But hey, maybe somebody will do something at some point. Because
Yes, maybe so.
it is an election year, so
Well, no one will do anything anything bold like that in the States until after November, and then we'll have to see. But yeah, there's stuff that people being creative could do, and that's another reason I wrote the article, is just to get some ideas out there, and maybe someone who's in a position to make some decisions will see it and be like, oh, there is more we could be doing. I don't see any NATO country, Black Sea or not, going and doing an ASW exercise, in the pocket between Sevastopol and Novorossiysk. But there's no reason they shouldn't. And, were I calm all world navies, that's the first thing I would try to do. So let's go up there and do some exercises and just be sitting around, doing gun X's, flying our helicopters, and kind of getting in the way of Russian ships coming in and out of Kerch or in and out of Novorossiysk.
hey,
And
Russians
see what
do
happens.
all sorts of provocative drills in various, highly sensitive areas. So why not? Why should we?
Oh, yeah. Why shouldn't we? So,
They're the aggressor. They're not afraid to provoke further
there
and
is
further.
apparently not much of an appetite. Right. So, and I think they know that on our side, there is a hesitance to provoke. So, and that's part of what Russia and other countries take advantage of.
So speaking of provocations, this is the area which, the governments love, and they love to use it, and usually they love to say why they can't do anything and somebody else can. But,
Mhm.
aside from the Montreux Convention, what other inter relevant international law treaties would be applicable here, and has anyone really tried to use them, if there are any, in a way that would justify any sort of effort aside from doing nothing?
Well, I mean, you can start at the top with the UN Charter. The whole conflict is a complete abrogation of what the UN Charter says, and that a member of the Security Council, it's one thing when the Central African Republic does something to one of its neighbors. It's another thing when a sitting member of the Security Council launches something like this and then vetoes a sanction against itself for doing so. Um, I would like to see, at that level, some talk about well, what does this charter really mean if this is the sort of actions that some of the most important countries in the world are going to take despite being members of it. And then you move it down one to UN clause. Russia is a signatory, and the boarding of the Shukura Khan, in my mind, was a clear violation of their obligations that they signed up for voluntarily under UN clause. Two important players in this picture are not signatories to UN clause, and that's my own country, the United States, and Turkey is also not a UN clause member. So, they haven't said we won't pester merchant shipping in this circumstance, but Russia has said that they won't do it, and then they did it. And I would like to see more people be, that's not cool. We shouldn't allow that.
Interesting. So there is actually a room for some sort of at least political pressure, if not anything more. But so far, it just hasn't really been
Yeah.
applied. But we keep coming back to the issue that people are always more focused on land, and air conflicts, not so much in the maritime. That there's this sort of lack of understanding. But from a strategic perspective, leaving aside the technical knowledge of how Navy operates and all of that, why has strategically there's been such a lackluster general interest until it becomes critically important, like in the Red Sea, and there's no way out of it? Why isn't there just general look at the map to see where there are important choke points that could be exploited and so forth?
Ooh, that's a whole nother hour in itself. Definitely some topics that I've spent some time thinking about. And I think it's hard to say at a population-based level, even many people in most countries live near the sea. I'm from Colorado. I'm 1,500 miles from the closest ocean. And, people in Colorado aren't really thinking about that stuff. They didn't realize that their prices went up in part because their maritime supply chains were disturbed during COVID and then by other factors immediately after COVID. And they don't make that connection. I think at political level, when you're talking politicians, parliaments, and the U.S. Congress, one, navies are more expensive for what looks like less capability. Land forces are kind of, for not much money, you get a lot of infantry and a bunch of tanks, compared to, for a good bit of money, you get some modern fighter jets and maybe a few bombers. For really a lot of money, you get like, take my favorite, Germany, 12 frigates. And then you have 12 frigates. It's a tiny force compared to the land. It's a tiny force. It's a much smaller force than the Air Force. The United States is different to most nations in the fact that the Navy and the Army have about the same number of personnel, around 350,000 active duty personnel. Most other nations, there's 10 times as many people in the Army as there are in the Navy. And that's even true in Britain today. Once the greatest sea power that the world had ever known, the Army is much, much larger than the Navy. And so those voices aren't at the table. They're not at the table inside ministries of defense. They're not at the table, if you take Germany, the senior German naval officer is a 3-star. There's several 4-star German Army officers. So he's always junior anytime they're meeting. That's more pronounced in other countries with even smaller navies in comparison to land forces. And then I think at political level, there's a lot of things that governments either have to or want to or have promised people they will pay for, and they get the least number of votes by paying for Navy stuff that generally benefits a few very small areas. I think it's, geographic areas. I think it's very telling that the one member of the German parliament who I know understands sea power and cares about it represents Wilhelmshaven, the largest naval base in Germany. And the one person in the U.S. Congress who I knew understood that and fought forward in Congress, she represented Norfolk, and she lost her last election. She was a former surface warfare officer. She lost her last election to a former naval aviator. So one less voice for sea power and one more voice for air power in Congress now. And I think those issues, there's a lot of stuff that governments have to pay for. And one of the most expensive things they can buy is a Navy. And one of the things that gets them the least political brownie points is a Navy.
It's funny. There's been a lot of talk how the current developments and all these events and conflicts we are seeing is a new World War One or a new World War Two, and I don't know which one it is or whether it's both or neither. But what I do know is that we are seeing a return to water maritime conflicts, which we haven't had at the scale in quite a long time, and that's the part that no one's talking about either.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting because a lot of the talk these days is about the rise of the Chinese Navy and how
Mm-hmm.
big it's gotten and that it's gotten much more capable and it's starting to deploy more and more frequently out of area. But what's brought about the maritime side of both the conflicts we discussed today was fairly basic forces with some fairly sophisticated but inexpensive weaponry. Everything from Ukraine's surface attack drones to the use of the homegrown Neptune missile. They did that without any ship larger than a small patrol boat. And the Houthis, apparently they do have a decent Coast Guard. They certainly have some very nice propaganda videos on YouTube about the Houthi Coast Guard. Whether those were created by by AI or not, I don't know. But they're certainly not using those boats. But they've got helicopters, they've got drones, and they've got some reasonably sophisticated anti-ship missiles. And without having a navy, they are forcing real navies to come and deal with that. And I think that might be the part that people who are very focused on the growth of the Chinese Navy might be missing. That is a very cheap and fairly easy to acquire weaponry can really challenge large, sophisticated navies.
And by the way, the state actors very much benefit from such, semi-asymmetrical conflicts with actors that are disposable and yet savvy enough to avoid complete destruction, or savvy enough to exploit the whatever political considerations are that are preventing them from being completely, decimated by US because the power, differential is considerable. But given that there is this political impediment, lack of political will or what have you, imagine for a second the scenario that Russia does decide to become much more aggressive in the Black Sea, and the Red Sea conflict does start getting out of hand as Houthis and the enablers become more successful at targeting. And China does decide to take advantage of such a scenario to launch some sort of a maritime conflict, or just let a conflict get out, a provocation escalate to the point of semi-accidental entry into a conflict in the South China Sea. How would the US and its allies handle such a scenario?
Oh, I don't want to predict how they would handle it, but I would say that they probably haven't thought through all the implications and all the opportunities too.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
China, people talk about China, they talk about Belt and Road, they talk about China's involvement in Africa as, and they see it only as a threat. I've never heard it, but it's not just a threat. All China's also taking risk. They're investing, they're putting their money, they're creating dependencies on things from far away that comes by sea. And as big and as capable as the Chinese Navy has become, I'm not sure they're yet in a position to defend the things they now depend on that come by sea from Africa or other places along the Belt and Road, um, where they've invested heavily. And I don't see enough talk about that being a risk for them and an opportunity for us. Maybe some people in some faraway headquarters are discussing that, but I haven't heard much on that front. And I think there are opportunities there, both to prevent conflict and, in the case of conflict, to not be as nakedly as exposed as a lot of doomsayers seem to think that other countries will be by that.
This level of risk aversion
Mhm.
is just sending some sort of a communication to outside powers that we, no matter what happens, we are not going to engage the same behavior. We are not going to get proxies involved. We are
Yeah,
not going to, you know, step in, and we are certainly not going to kind of sink their ships or do anything, of that sort. So, is it there's an element of strategic ambiguity over our intentions that seems to be missing from
right.
from our posture and our strategic communications. And I'm wondering, I mean, let's say they don't want to engage in risk averse behavior, but why do they think it's a good idea to let everyone know where our red line is?
Right. Um, we've had a red line in the past that got crossed and not much happened afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm not sure how I feel about strategic ambiguity as a strategy. I can see why some people think it's the right choice, especially when it comes to Taiwan. I can also see why the counter argument is true. Um, I think if you've signed up for an international convention like UNCLOS and you violate it, then the strategic ambiguity shouldn't be there. That should be like, that's not something we're going to do, and there's going to be consequences of some sort. Like, should we launch nuclear missiles at Russia because they boarded a ship in violation of UNCLOS? That might be a little too much. But there's no reason, like, okay, we have laid sanctions on certain Russian exports. Why aren't we boarding their ships? One, because most of that stuff is not being transported on Russian flagged vessels or Russian owned vessels. It's the international merchant community is perfectly happy to carry sanctioned Russian oil because they're making money off of it. But that doesn't mean we couldn't go a little bit farther in places where we do exercise sea control, and that might be fun to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are all very legitimate questions, but given the current situation, given the fact that we only seem to be selectively taking the freedom of navigation seriously, what does foretell about the freedom of navigation in general? We're already seeing the Somali pirates jumping in either randomly or in coordination with the Houthis. And there's
Yeah.
no evidence either way, but they're certainly there. And can we
Mm-hmm.
see significant smaller challenges to trade by pirates, assorted criminal
Yeah.
contingents, and the version of quote unquote Russian hackers, meaning not exactly state affiliated, but also sort of carrying water for states, kind of
Yeah.
enter the fray in various parts of the world.
Yeah. So I don't want to say anything to cyber because that's a realm that I know
Mhm,
very little about. Um, as far as piracy, you saw and you've seen with what's going on in the Southern Red Sea with the Houthis that
mhm,
you know the world, and I think we can safely say the world has responded pretty strongly. Um, the strong response doesn't necessarily mean it's a tactically easy situation. Tactically down there, those ships are facing challenges every day. Um, they resolving Somali piracy the first time. Now it looks like we maybe have to do it again. That also wasn't tactically easy. It took time and it took developing of new procedures and developing of new structures. But the will and the the, the willingness to expend resources on it was definitely there from the beginning. So I think what's happened is people have lost the ability to think creatively on our side about pushing back against, China and Russia are very good at exploiting the seams between the existing rules, and then being able to say, well, that wasn't illegal what we did, but it was intended to be like it was illegal. It was intended to be annoying or disruptive or detrimental without blatantly violating the rules that they've agreed to. And we're not very good at figuring out how to push back about that. I think they're much more creative on that front.
Hmm. Well, on
I don't think it's a lack of will, but a lack of ability to think about and come up with, and maybe a little bit of a lack of backbone of like, if we do this, it's going to be super provocative. Sometimes it's okay to be a little provocative. Sometimes the way you get the bully to stop like messing with you on the playground is to stand up to him and yell in his face. So
what can Ukraine and nearby countries do to promote grain security given what is happening? I know tactical they've been kind of trying to destroy the ships. Is there anything more they can do without the NATO forces actually doing any of the wonderful things that you've mentioned?
yes, and I discussed this a little bit in the article. And again, finance is certainly not my area of expertise, but it's obvious that the shipping industry's risk aversion and risk willingness based on insurance prices or reflected in insurance prices is what drives their willingness. If they knew they were going to make a huge profit carrying grain, they would, and by taking the shortest route straight across the international waters of the Black Sea, they'd be doing it. But they're not going to, with the insurance premiums and the chance of losing a ship. And I think that's why you see this huge response in the Red Sea is, as opposed to piracy. Piracy was bad, but the merchant ships kept going through that way. They didn't go around. And the difference is that, for $5 million, they pretty sure they were going to get their ship and crew back. And $5 million is, a ship and a cargo may be worth 50 or $100 million. So they were willing to spend $5 million to not have to go around on the off chance that theirs was the ship that got, kidnapped by the Somali pirates. They're not willing to risk losing, $100 million ship and cargo, which is what happens when a C-802 missile slams into the side of it sometimes. So I think that's where you're seeing the difference. So what can be done in the case of the Black Sea, in my mind, and I mentioned this in the article, is subsidizing some of those war risk costs. Putting a financial incentive, and Ukraine has done this, and they've worked with Lloyd's of London to work on insurance rates. And I'll be perfectly honest, I haven't followed up since I wrote the article on how that's developed. And it was pretty new when I wrote it. But I think that's a great step in the right direction. And Western governments could also be, if we're willing to spend all this other money on Ukraine, that would be actually a really good place to put some money, subsidizing the risk cost to the shipping industry.
And speaking of risk course and insurance, one of the developments that I've touched on in a discussion on another program was the risk of the insurance business and the flagging business being taken over by Russian, Chinese, and other non-Western and not necessarily friendly companies popping up in response to the Red Sea threat situation. But it could also happen elsewhere, like the Black Sea. And if that happens, what that could do serious financial damage to Western interests. But what if anything can be done to prevent it? And does can we actually do anything about it and prevent these countries from capitalizing on the risk they themselves are creating?
Right. I'm not too sure on that front. I've long been a proponent of repealing the Jones Act in the United States and just encouraging more United States merchant shipping, civilian merchant shipping, and not just government owned. I think that's less of a problem in most European countries. The ownership insurance agent trail for most ships is so convoluted and passes through 6 or 7 countries and often through some fake address in Hong Kong or something like that, that I don't know what else you could do without completely restructuring the entire owner and financial system behind the shipping industry. And again, that finance stuff is just not my area of expertise.
So, given all that we've discussed, do you see any relevant strategies concerning this sort of maritime security actually being discussed practically right now from the relevant bodies? And also, is there anything that you haven't mentioned specifically in your article that you think is worth bringing to the attention of the decision makers?
To answer the first question, I think I've kind of, well, I actually kind of answers both questions. I think I've kind of touched on more or less everything. The one thing I did mention in the article that we haven't discussed yet was flags of convenience,
Mm-hmm.
and how that didn't offer much protection in the Black Sea. But now with the Houthi thing, we see that it doesn't matter what flag you are,
Mm-hmm.
Western navies or the Indian Navy are going to protect you. So that aspect of it, I'm not tight. I think there's a big geography piece that plays into the Black Sea part that, in the Red Sea, those navies are able to come and protect kind of anyone. But I would definitely take a look at the flags of convenience. I don't see a huge reason. I see some philosophical reasons, but not some practical reasons why, for example, the U.S. taxpayer needs to subsidize a merchant shipping company that chooses to pay its registration dues to the Marshall Islands or to Liberia, and yet depend on the U.S. Navy to see it safely through the Red Sea. I think something could be done there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, hopefully, the powers that be will see both the article and our discussion and come to a conclusion that some risks may be worth taking, and maybe they're not such great risks at all. Maybe the only issue we have is like this maybe we're playing poker, and maybe Russia has and some of its allies have weaker hands in certain respects, and they're only working off our unwillingness to engage, not because they necessarily are in a position
right.
to do anything about it once we do.
Right. I think I wouldn't use the word unwillingness to engage, but hesitancy to determine good paths to engage. I think that
Mm-hmm.
probably describes that situation better. I think there's lots of people who want to do something, but they just can't find something that's going to be palatable to all the decision makers.
Mm-hmm. That's a fair assessment. Well, thank you so much. This was
Oh, it's
really
been my absolute pleasure. This has been delightful. Thank you so much for inviting me on board. And if
thank
I could
you.
just like to wish, there are some people out there taking risk, and those are the crews on the ships right now
Mm-hmm.
in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, who are every day dealing with drone and missile attacks, and so far have been doing a wonderful job of protecting themselves and the merchant ships from them. So,
And that's also a very important point, and I think we should all be grateful for that, and hopefully we will have soon come to a situation where our objectives and our methods of meeting them finally align.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again so much, Irina.
Thank you, and for those watching, thanks for joining in. Tune in next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. For our next program, and have a great night.